A lot of people ask me when to use Cowork versus Claude Code, which I'm sure is a question you get a lot. Do you have a simple kind of like heuristic?
Yes. I have a blog post that I wrote about this. So you go to claude.com/blog, and I think the title is How to Get Started with Cowork. So I wrote up a whole guide around like when to reach for what and like why. Here's the sort of like simple like mind map that I built, which is like if your ultimate like outcome that you want is just going to be like a conversation, just reach for chat. At the end of this, like I don't need to walk away with anything other than like just having a conversation with Claude. Then it's like just reach for chat. If at the end of a conversation, you actually want some sort of like deliverable, particularly if it's like knowledge work shaped, like let's say it's like a file or it's like a sheet or like a deck or something, like Cowork is very useful for that. And like the beauty of Cowork is it's powered by the same harness as Claude Code. So underneath the hood, Cowork is Claude Code. Underneath the hood for ChatGPT Work is Codex. They're all powered by the same harness. It's almost like a different like front-end UI for people who maybe are less technical. They don't need to see, Claude or Codex write like a bunch of like code. They want to leverage that sort of like agentic harness, that like being able to take multi-turns without seeing all of that actually happen. So like those are what those products are used for. And the other good thing about Cowork is if you have like a lot of like different inputs, let's say it's like, oh, I'm uploading like, a couple of different spreadsheets and like a PDF. And I also have like maybe some MCPs that I'm connected in here. And at the very end, I'm looking for like a deliverable. That's what Cowork is really, really good for. My general sort of rule of thumb for like non-technical folks is unless you're like actually doing like true coding, like you're like, pushing code into a repo or you're like building an app, you probably don't need to reach for tools like Claude Code. You can just probably stay within like the chat and like Cowork sphere because your work is generally just only going to be knowledge work shaped. Like you'll know if you need to use like a Claude Code or a Codex. Most of the confusion comes around when do I reach for chat versus like a Cowork or a ChatGPT work. And again, like I just think about like what is the end state? What is the deliverable I want in the end? If it's just a conversation, I just want to riff on something, brainstorming, chat will do perfectly fine. You don't need to reach for Cowork.
Being on the inside, what do you think is normal to you in your use of Claude Code or Cowork or whatever that people outside are maybe a couple of months behind? Like, is there a feature or a setting or like /loop that you find you're using a lot that other people maybe aren't?
I think like loop engineering has been like a really big one. I think to some degree, a lot of developers these days are already very much like, loop pilled. That's kind of like the hot topic on Twitter, like 2 weeks ago. I would say for non-technical people who are building, I think most people, the way they would approach it is like, maybe I'll boot up Claude Code or maybe Codex. I'll go in and then I'll just like prompt, get a response, the model will like build something and then like I'll maybe test it out and then I'll go back and prompt some more. And then it's like this back and forth, it's a very traditional way of like engaging with an LLM, right? But I think what some of the non-technical builders haven't fully adopted yet are going to be things like loops actually. And also like, even like /goal, where like you give the model like, here's like an objective, like end state of what I want to build. And I want you to then go out and basically build that, try to achieve this goal. And at the same time, you tackle like a loop and say like, hey, like here's like some of the objective things that I want you to then go back and like check in on to make sure we're on track to ensure that we hit this goal. And then you just let the model kind of run for a bit and see what it comes back with. And most of the time, like with like, some good prompting, like you can actually do a lot of the work up front and say like, I want to build this, like here's like the criteria, here's like the exit criteria, like here are the features I want you to build, as opposed to doing it piecemeal, then saying like, okay, you built this, okay, now do that. Okay, I'll review this. Okay, now do that. The models are really good these days where it can get you to a pretty solid state of, a pretty good product just by using a combination of goal and loops.
Nice. Are there any skills that you've built or used that are now kind of core? Like if you took them away, you would be much worse off?
Funny enough, like I probably use less skills than I think many marketers might.
Okay.
So one of my other sort of hot takes I talked about is like, I think there's like this concept of like, you got to build as many skills as possible. Like you'll see like a lot of these GitHub repos, particularly for marketing, where it's like, you got to download like these like 50 skills. It's going to replace your marketing org. Like you're going to save, millions of dollars by using these skills. And I take a look at some of these repos and I open the skills and I'm like reading through some of them. And I'm like, one, some of these skills don't actually provide the model with more context at runtime that the model already doesn't know. Because the benefit of skills, right? One is that there's like the progressive disclosure portion where it's like you can provide, a description and then, at runtime, like the model can then say like, oh, like, Austin's asking about a certain thing. Let me take a look at my context and see if there's like an applicable skill that I can then pull up and then read without clogging the context window. So progressive disclosure is one benefit of skill. The other benefit is, can you provide the model with more instruction, details, context instructions, whatever, at runtime that the model innately does not have? And as the models get like smarter and smarter and get like more parameters and, have more knowledge around like maybe the different marketing functions, it's going to know a lot of things that probably don't require skills to then give it additional context on. So I think skills in general can actually be simplified a lot because the models are very smart.
Okay.
The other aspect of skills, like at least for me personally, is I find that I only really want to create a skill when it's something that is like truly highly repeatable, so that there's like a lot of volume. So like the frequency is high enough for me to then say like, I want to encode this into a skill because I'm going to use this on a very, very consistent basis. Then that's the time where I'm like, okay, let me actually like sit down and turn this to a skill. But for some of like the smaller things, like I generally like actually don't really use skills that much.
What do you think people should, what context should people be giving the model instead of a skill that's like, oh, you're an expert SEO, write 10 blog posts?
Yeah, like the stuff like before where it's like, hey, you're an expert, marketer, yada, yada. Like you need to come up with like, a strategy for, my keyword research. Claude, ChatGPT, they know a lot about SEO already. You don't need to tell it like, hey, you are an expert at SEO. Instead, like what skills are very valuable for, again, when you think about what I just mentioned around like, what is the context you can provide the model that it does not have a runtime? The model knows nothing about like your company, your marketing objectives, what like your marketing program looks like what's your portfolio. Those are very important pieces of context that I think do make sense to provide maybe as a skill. So for example, like a lot of companies might have like a brand tone sort of skill when they're like trying to work through maybe like some copy for email or for like a blog post. That's very valuable because a model probably has no idea like what your company's actual brand guidelines are. It's probably going to be pretty useful to actually have that as a skill.
Nice. Yeah, we have all of those for Profound too, of brand guidelines, tone of voice, product lines. Mm-hmm. I found this helpful because we ship very quickly, as Anthropic and other companies do too, that sometimes the models can't keep up with what our new products are, what they do, the features. And then so we keep a skill library.
That's like huge. At some point, like we even came up with a skill to basically teach Claude about like our like API features and pricing and like all that stuff, because like if you take a look at like the cutoff date for the training data, it's like, it's months behind, maybe like a year behind, right? And oftentimes like during that sort of like that time in between when the cutoff date was versus like now, present reality, a lot has changed, a lot has happened. There's probably going to be a bunch more products that have been launched, a bunch of new features. And what would oftentimes happen is you'd ask Claude like, hey, I need you to, help me implement something with like, let's say like the Claude SDK. And then like Claude will respond with something that's completely outdated. So then we had to basically build a skill to then tell Claude like, hey, if we're talking about like, the API or something related to like documentation with the API, like, here's the skill, reference the skill, and then maybe do like a web fetch on like our latest API docs, just to make sure you have like the most up-to-date like information. Or even if you were saying like, oh, I want you to add in this new model string for this new model, and Claude would be like, oh, that model isn't released yet, Nice. Stuff like that happens all the time.
When you use Claude, you more of a desktop app or a terminal kind of Claude user?
I've always been more of like a terminal user. Okay. And that's largely just because like when I first started using Claude Code, it was only available in the terminal. Mm-hmm. And then later on, when it was added to the desktop app, it was like, I was also a desktop app user just for Cowork and for regular chats. Mm-hmm. But I never quite fully switched over to using Claude Code on the desktop app. I still sort of default to terminal. It was just force of habit, to be honest. Yeah.